All right, let's just dive right in. There's this one question that's been around forever, right? It trips up pretty much everyone believers, skeptics, you name it. If God is supposed to be all good and all powerful, then what's with all the suffering in the world? Well, today we're going to look at how the philosopher Peter van Inwagen tackled this. And here's the twist. He didn't just try to answer it. He basically said we've been asking the question all wrong. Yeah, so we're diving into his huge work, The Problem of Evil. And what's so interesting here is that Van Inwagen isn't really trying to give us some neat, tidy answer. Nope. What he does instead is give us a whole new toolkit, a philosophical toolkit, designed to help us take apart and really re-examine the whole argument against God's existence. First things first, Van Inwagen doesn't shy away from the brutal reality of it all. I mean, he starts by saying, look, the world is filled with a vast amount of suffering. And for a lot of people, that's not just a sad fact of life, it's the number one reason, the biggest intellectual hurdle to believing in a God who's supposed to be both all-powerful and perfectly good. And that right there, that's the classic argument from evil. It seems to put you in a tough spot, doesn't it? It's like you have to choose. Either God doesn't exist, or maybe he's not the all-good, all-powerful being people say he is. Because how can those two things exist at the same time? Horrible suffering and a perfect God. They just seem to completely contradict each other. But this is where Van Inwagen steps in and says, hold on a second. Before we even try to answer that big question, we have to get clear on what problem we're actually trying to solve. He thinks we're all just asking the wrong questions from the get-go. And this is his first really big idea. He says that we just throw everything into one big bucket called the problem of evil, and that creates a total mess. It's all tangled up. So if we want to make any real progress, the very first thing we have to do is start untangling it all. Just think about it for a second. The kind of problem a grieving parent is facing, that deeply personal, gut-wrenching why me, that is a completely different universe from the abstract, theoretical problem a philosopher is chewing on in their office, right? They need totally different kinds of answers. So Van Inwagen decides to zoom in on just one of these. That last one, the apoplectic problem. He makes it clear that he's not trying to solve an emotional crisis or answer a deep theological question. He's treating the argument from evil as a specific philosophical argument that you can and should analyze with logic. Okay, so let's get into this, because this is where it gets really good. He introduces this one distinction that it completely changes the game. It reframes the entire goal of the debate. I'd say this is probably one of the most important tools in his whole toolkit. Okay, look at the difference here. On one hand, you have a theodicy. A theodicy makes this enormous claim. It's basically saying, okay, folks, this is the real, actual reason God permits evil. But then you have a defense, which is way, way more modest. A defense just says, hey, here's a possible story, a story that, for all anyone knows, could be true. And this story shows that it's at least possible for God and evil to exist at the same time. And this courtroom analogy he uses, it's brilliant. Think about it. A defense attorney in a trial doesn't have to prove what really happened. All they have to do is present a plausible story, an alternative that makes the jury think, maybe. It creates reasonable doubt. And Van Inwagen says that's all you need to do to neutralize the argument from evil. All right, so if the whole point is to offer a defense, then what or who are we actually defending? Then Inwagen says before we can even start to look at an argument against God, we have to be super clear on the idea of God that's on the table. And he's not talking about some vague, higher power kind of idea. No, he's focusing on the big traditional concept of God that you see in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. A being who is all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good. These are the non-negotiables. So if the argument from evil is going to work, it has to work against this very specific, very high-stakes version of God. And this isn't just some random shopping list of cool powers. There's a central idea holding it all together, and he gets this from the philosopher St. Anselm. The core concept is that God is a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. I mean, basically, the greatest possible being you can imagine. All those other attributes, all-powerful, all-knowing, they're just our attempt to describe what that greatest possible being would be like. So let's recap. We have the right kind of problem identified, we have the right strategy, a defense, not a theodicy, and we have the right target, this greatest possible being. With all his tools laid out on the table, Van Inwagen is ready to give his verdict. And it is a bombshell. He concludes that the argument from evil, when you treat it like a proper philosophical argument, fails. Okay, but fails? What does that even mean for a philosophical argument to fail? This question is what leads to what I think is his most out there and most interesting idea. He suggests that, hey, before we can even judge this argument, we need a totally new way of thinking about what makes any philosophical argument a success or a failure. Right off the bat, he just throws out the old standard. You know, the idea that for an argument to succeed, it has to be this perfectly airtight proof that forces every rational person on Earth to agree with it. Van Inwagen says, no way. That's an impossibly high bar. So he suggests a different test. For him, an argument fails if it can't convince an ideal, totally neutral audience. See, the point isn't whether you can poke some tiny little hole in the logic. The real question is, does this argument have enough juice to actually persuade a group of smart, informed people who are starting from a completely neutral position? He wants us to picture this perfect debate scenario. You've got the best possible person arguing for the argument from evil. You've got the best possible critic pointing out all its weaknesses, and they're both making your case to a jury of ideal agnostics, people with zero bias either way. If, at the end of all that, the jury is still just not convinced, well, then the argument has failed. It didn't do what it was supposed to do. And you see how this just totally flips the script? The person defending belief in God doesn't have to prove God exists. That's not their job here. All they have to do is show that the argument from evil isn't the slam dunk, silver bullet everyone thinks it is. That it's just not strong enough to force a reasonable, neutral person to become an atheist. The goal here is defense, not offense. So in the end, what Van Inwagen's toolkit really does is change the question we're asking. We stop shouting this unanswerable question up at the sky. Why, God, did you allow this to happen? And instead, we turn it around and ask a much more human question of ourselves. Is the argument from evil really the logical knockout punch its supporters think it is? Or has its real power always been less about logic and more about emotion?